David Mercer thought he knew every secret his wife Lauren ever kept until the night he found her lying lifeless on their bedroom floor, her blood pooling beneath her wedding ring. Hours later, police discovered he had taken a photo of her body and sent it to another woman. What no one knew then was that the truth behind that single image would unravel a story far darker than anyone imagined. David Harris was known in his quiet suburban neighborhood as the kind of man who never raised his voice. He worked at a construction firm, starting his mornings before sunrise and returning home well after dark, his clothes smelling faintly of sawdust and concrete. Neighbors waved when they saw him, and he waved back with a polite smile. To outsiders, his life seemed steady, predictable, almost enviable: a stable job, a nice home, and a wife who appeared devoted. But the reality was far less perfect. The marriage he shared with Lauren had been eroding for years, and the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Lauren had once been his anchor, someone who laughed at his bad jokes and filled the house with warmth. Now, she felt like a stranger. She began taking weekend trips with friends David didn't know, staying out late on weeknights with vague explanations about catching up after work. At first, he convinced himself it was harmless. People change, he told himself. Maybe she was simply going through a phase. But as the weeks passed, the unease in his stomach hardened into something sharper. He started noticing details he couldn't explain away. A new perfume, strong and floral, lingered in the bedroom even when she hadn't been home all day. There was a new dress, sleek and revealing, tucked into her closet with the tag still attached. When he asked where it came from, she casually said she bought it on sale, but her eyes flickered away when she spoke. David began paying attention to her phone habits. She kept it with her constantly, even taking it into the bathroom, the screen always locked. If a message appeared, she would tilt it away from him before reading it. The breaking point came on a dull Saturday afternoon when she left her tablet on the couch while stepping out to water the plants. David picked it up without thinking, scrolling absent-mindedly until a photo appeared on the screen that made his hands freeze. It was Lauren, wearing the black dress he had never seen her wear at home, standing in a hotel room he didn't recognize. Her hair was styled in loose curls, her lipstick dark and bold. She was smiling, not the casual smile she gave him, but something more mischievous, almost daring. The photo was saved in a hidden folder alongside others, some blurred, some clearly taken by someone else. David's chest tightened, his thoughts spiraling in a storm of humiliation and anger. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It felt like confirmation. He sat there staring at the photo, his hands trembling, the air in the room feeling heavy and stale. Questions battered his mind in quick succession: who had taken the picture, how long it had been going on, whether the neighbors or his friends knew before he did. The idea of being the last to know, the one everyone pitied behind closed doors, made his stomach churn. From that moment, his life became divided into two parts: before the photo and after it. Before, he had been a man trying to make his marriage work, believing that patience might fix what was broken. After, he became consumed by the need to know every detail, to confirm every suspicion. He started following Lauren's car when she said she was going to meet friends, keeping a safe distance but never losing sight of her. Some nights, he sat in his truck outside coffee shops and bars, watching through the window as she laughed with people he didn't recognize. His work suffered. His boss noticed him making mistakes, forgetting deadlines, and showing up late. Friends invited him out, but he declined every time, unwilling to leave the house for long in case Lauren returned and he missed a chance to catch her in a lie. The thought of confronting her played over and over in his head, but each imagined conversation ended the same way, with her denying everything, smiling in that calm way she always did, leaving him to wonder if she was mocking him. David told himself he needed proof, real proof. He began checking her phone when she left it unattended, which was rare. When he finally got the chance, his suspicions deepened. There were messages from an unknown number, short but suggestive, mentioning meeting times and missing last night. Her responses were brief but seemed intimate. They used strange phrases that could have been innocent but didn't feel that way to him. The more he read, the more convinced he became that she had moved beyond emotional distance and into outright betrayal. At night, lying awake beside her, David would stare at the ceiling and think about the life they had built together. He thought about the sacrifices he had made, the years he had worked to provide for them both, and how quickly it all felt meaningless. He imagined her in someone else's arms, laughing, sharing the parts of herself that she had been withholding from him. It was like a poison, slow and steady, eating away at every ounce of reason he had left. The image from the tablet never left his mind. Sometimes in the middle of the day, it would flash in his memory, vivid and sharp, bringing the same rush of heat to his face. He stopped seeing Lauren as his wife and started seeing her as the source of his humiliation. Every interaction between them became laced with unspoken hostility. She seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was pretending not to notice, going about her routines with an almost exaggerated normalcy that made him feel mocked. David's friends would later say he had changed in those weeks, that his eyes seemed darker and his words more clipped. He smiled less, spoke less, and when he did, it was with an edge that hadn't been there before. Inside his mind, a dangerous idea was beginning to take shape. He told himself he was only thinking about it, that it was just a fantasy born from anger. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way to reclaim the control he had lost. The day he first pictured it clearly, he was sitting in his truck outside the house, watching Lauren through the kitchen window as she poured herself a glass of wine. She was smiling at something on her phone, tapping the screen quickly before setting it down. David's hands clenched on the steering wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. In that moment, the line between thought and intention blurred, and he found himself wondering not if he would act, but when. By then, the quiet, polite man the neighbors knew was already gone. What remained was someone else entirely, someone who saw his wife not as a partner, but as an enemy who had taken something from him that could never be returned. The next steps felt inevitable, as if they had been set in motion the moment he saw that photograph. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into obsession. David moved through his days as if on autopilot, his body present, but his mind trapped in a loop of questions, suspicions, and mental images he couldn't erase. Every sound, every unexplained movement from Lauren became another piece of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. He stopped trusting anything she said. If she mentioned meeting a friend for coffee, he imagined her slipping into someone's car instead. If she stayed late at work, he pictured her in a dim hotel room, her phone turned off, the hours vanishing without explanation. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, each one ending in a rush of anxiety. He would wake in the dark, the room silent except for her steady breathing, and lie there staring at the faint outline of her figure in the shadows. He wondered if she was dreaming of someone else. That thought burned more than anything else, not just the idea of her body with another man, but her mind, her heart, her laughter belonging to someone who wasn't him. David's attempts to find proof became more methodical. He kept a mental log of her comings and goings, noting times and locations, comparing them to receipts he sometimes found in her purse. He began searching her car when she was in the shower, looking for anything, a piece of clothing, a stray receipt, a trace of perfume that wasn't hers. He installed a cheap tracking app on her phone one evening when she left it unattended on the counter for less than a minute. From then on, he checked her location constantly, watching the little dot move across the map like a predator stalking prey. Some nights, he followed her in his truck. He kept the headlights dim, staying several cars behind, blending into the flow of traffic. Most of the time, she went where she said she was going: a friend's apartment, the grocery store, the gym. But on 2 occasions, she drove to a part of the city David didn't recognize, parking outside the same small apartment complex. She stayed inside for hours, the lights in one second-story window glowing faintly. Each time, David sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel until his hands went numb, fighting the urge to storm upstairs and see for himself. The text messages he intercepted from her phone became his private torment. They were never explicitly incriminating, but to him, they dripped with hidden meaning. Short lines about missing last night or looking forward to the weekend made his blood run cold. There were no names saved with these numbers, only digits, which made it worse. The mystery of the other man became as consuming as the betrayal itself. He built a mental image of him, a smug, confident stranger who had taken what was his and laughed about it behind his back. David's work life began to unravel. He forgot to respond to important emails, missed meetings, and made errors in his reports. His boss called him into the office twice to ask if everything was okay, but David brushed it off, claiming he was just tired. The truth was, his entire life outside of this obsession had become irrelevant. Even food lost its appeal. He often skipped dinner, sitting in the dark with a beer in hand, staring at the glow of his phone as he tracked her movements. Lauren didn't seem to notice the full extent of his watchfulness, or if she did, she hid it well. She moved through their home as if nothing had changed, humming softly while cooking, smiling faintly when their eyes met, asking casual questions about his day. Her calmness infuriated him. To David, it was proof of her duplicity. Only a skilled liar could appear so serene while hiding something so destructive. He began interpreting every word she spoke as a carefully constructed part of her cover. The more time passed, the more David convinced himself that his situation was not just about infidelity, it was about dignity. He saw himself as a man being mocked in his own home, stripped of respect by the one person who should have been loyal to him above all others. In his mind, this wasn't just personal, it was a public humiliation, an invisible stain on his name. He imagined neighbors whispering, friends shaking their heads in pity. The idea festered until it felt like a wound that could never heal. His fantasies about confronting her began as imagined arguments, raising his voice, demanding answers, watching her stumble through excuses. But gradually, those visions turned darker. He pictured her trapped, unable to talk her way out of the truth. He imagined what it would feel like to stop her lies permanently, to see the fear replace the calm on her face. These thoughts frightened him at first, but over time, they became oddly comforting. They gave him a sense of control in a situation where he otherwise felt powerless. One night, after hours of pacing the living room while Lauren was out, David sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad. He began to write out what he knew, listing the dates, the places, the times she had been somewhere suspicious. The list was longer than he expected. Seeing it on paper made it feel official, like evidence in a case. But it also deepened the sense that this was no longer just about discovering the truth, it was about what he would do with it. His thoughts began circling one conclusion. Simply leaving her wasn't enough. Divorce wouldn't erase the humiliation. He would still walk through life knowing she had betrayed him, knowing people might always see him as the man who was cheated on. The only way to truly erase it, to rewrite the ending, was to make sure she could never humiliate him again. In the days that followed, David's demeanor changed subtly. To the outside world, he seemed calmer, almost resigned, but it was the stillness of a man who had made a decision. He stopped following her every night, stopped obsessively checking the tracker, but only because he no longer needed confirmation. In his mind, he already had all the proof he required. One rainy evening, as Lauren prepared to go out again, David watched her from the doorway. She wore a fitted coat and a silk scarf, her hair pinned back neatly. She smiled as she passed him, reaching for her keys, unaware of the storm gathering in his mind. He felt no urge to stop her from leaving that night. Instead, he waited in the quiet house, listening to the rain tap against the windows, knowing that soon, the waiting would be over. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her returning hours later. Her footsteps were light, her breathing even as she slid under the covers. David didn't move. His decision had crystallized into something solid, something inevitable. He no longer wondered if he would act only when. On a Thursday evening, the sky was heavy with low clouds, and a steady drizzle tapped against the windows. David drove home slowly, the wipers swishing back and forth in a steady rhythm, his mind somewhere else entirely. He had spent the entire day going through the motions at work, barely hearing his coworkers, his thoughts consumed with the plan that had been taking shape for weeks. It wasn't a sudden decision anymore. It had matured in his mind, moving from a dark fantasy to a concrete series of steps. Tonight would be the night. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. When he walked through the front door, the house felt unusually warm and quiet. Lauren was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The smell of roasted vegetables and herbs drifted through the air, but it did nothing to ease the tension building in his chest. He set his jacket down carefully, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. She seemed relaxed, even cheerful, moving between the counter and the stove as if there were no storm gathering just a few feet away. David kept his voice steady, making small comments about the rain, about how the roads were slick, about the day's work. He didn't want her to sense anything different. The last thing he wanted was for her to see the truth before it happened. Over dinner, he watched her closely. She ate without any sign of discomfort, sipping her wine, occasionally glancing at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. Every casual movement, every faint smile, only fueled the quiet rage inside him. When the plates were cleared, David suggested they check on something in the garage, an excuse he had used in his head a dozen times before. He mentioned that one of the tools was making a strange noise, that he wanted her opinion. Lauren hesitated for a second, then agreed, slipping on a light sweater before following him. The garage smelled faintly of oil and metal, its single bulb casting a yellowish light over the concrete floor. David had already placed the wrench on the workbench earlier in the day, its cold steel surface gleaming under the light. It was heavy in his hand when he picked it up, the weight familiar from years of use. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For a split second, there was an almost imperceptible flicker of confusion in her eyes, as if she sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite place it. The first swing was fast and decisive, the sound muffled by the rain outside. Lauren's body crumpled instantly, collapsing onto the cold floor. The impact left a ringing in David's ears, but he didn't stop. He acted with the precision of someone carrying out a task that had been rehearsed over and over in the mind. When it was over, the only sounds were his heavy breathing and the faint hum of the garage light. David stood over her motionless form, staring down with a strange mix of emptiness and clarity. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the edges of the world blurring. The anger that had driven him for weeks was gone, replaced by something colder, heavier. He wasn't sure if it was relief or something far darker. He dragged her body into the living room, leaving faint smears on the floor that the rain's dampness had already begun to blur. He arranged her on the rug in a deliberate position, adjusting her hair, straightening her limbs. It wasn't about respect, it was about control. Every detail was intentional, part of the image he was about to create. Taking out his phone, David crouched beside her and snapped a photograph. The click of the camera sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the silence. He looked at the screen, studying the image. It was shocking, undeniable. The kind of image that would burn itself into a person's mind the moment they saw it. Without hesitation, he opened his messages and found the number he believed belonged to her lover. His thumbs moved quickly, attaching the photograph and sending it without a single word. He didn't need to explain. The picture spoke for itself. The minutes that followed stretched like hours. David paced the room, glancing at his phone every few seconds. His hands were still slick with sweat, his pulse a slow, pounding drumbeat in his head. Finally, the phone vibrated with a reply. He opened it quickly, expecting perhaps a smug confession or a taunting remark. Instead, the message was short, frantic, filled with confusion and horror. It didn't fit the image David had built of the other man. There was no arrogance, no gloating, just disbelief and fear. The following messages came rapidly, demanding to know what had happened, insisting there had been some kind of mistake. The tone unsettled him. He read the words again, slower this time, and something began to shift in his mind. Could it be possible that this man wasn't her lover at all? The thought struck him like a cold gust of wind, and for the first time that night, a flicker of doubt crept in. But then he shook his head, refusing to entertain it. He had seen the messages, the photograph from the tablet, the unexplained trips. There was no other explanation. This man was just pretending now, trying to protect himself. That was what David told himself, though deep down, a quiet unease had begun to stir. He sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the lifeless form on the rug. The house felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, drumming steadily on the roof. The adrenaline that had kept him moving began to fade, replaced by a leaden fatigue. He realized suddenly that he had no real plan for what came next. The act itself had been the destination in his mind. He had never thought beyond it. In the dim light of the room, his phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't the same number. The notification came from an unknown sender, and the message was simple. The police had been contacted. David stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. He looked toward the window, half expecting to see flashing lights already approaching. For the first time that night, fear began to take hold, not the fear of what he had imagined before, of humiliation or betrayal, but the fear of what was about to happen to him. David remained seated on the couch, the phone still in his hand, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across his face. The words from the last message replayed in his mind. The police had been contacted. He wasn't sure if it was a bluff or the truth, but he knew deep down that time was slipping away. The house felt unnaturally quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the relentless patter of rain against the windows. Lauren's body lay still on the rug, the once vibrant warmth of her presence replaced by a cold, immovable weight in the room. He read the earlier messages again, this time with the creeping realization that something didn't add up. The man's frantic tone didn't match the image he had built of a smug rival gloating over stolen affection. There had been no accusations, no attempts to provoke him, only shock, confusion, and a repeated insistence that there had been a mistake. The more he thought about it, the more his certainty began to fracture. The memories of the texts he'd seen on Lauren's phone returned in fragments, short, vague messages, none of them explicitly romantic. Could they have been something else entirely? His stomach turned at the thought. If he was wrong, if all of this was built on an assumption that had spiraled into a deadly decision, then nothing he told himself over the past weeks could justify what he had done. He stood up and began pacing, his mind replaying every piece of so-called evidence he had collected. The hotel room photo, the late nights, the perfume, the visits to the unfamiliar apartment complex. Each detail still seemed damning on its own, but together, they no longer felt like irrefutable proof. The phone vibrated again. Another message from the same man. This time, it was longer, almost pleading. He said he had been helping Lauren plan a surprise for their anniversary. He mentioned that the trips to the apartment complex had been to meet with a friend who was making arrangements. The photo David had found, the one in the black dress, had been part of a fitting for the night she had wanted to surprise him. David froze in place, his eyes locked on the screen as the words burned into him. His mouth went dry, his pulse thudding in his ears. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. Yet, as he stood there, the story began to fit in ways that made his own version unravel completely. The man's name wasn't even familiar to him, not an old coworker, not someone from her gym. He was just a friend from her college days, someone she trusted to help her without spoiling the surprise. The room seemed to tilt as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. Everything, the tracking, the late night following, the sleepless obsession, had been built on a series of misinterpretations. His mind had filled in gaps with suspicion, twisting every innocent action into something sinister. And now, the end result was lying motionless in the middle of the room, the life gone from her because he had been too blinded by jealousy to ask questions. The sound of a siren in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. It was faint at first, barely noticeable under the rain, but it grew steadily louder. David's eyes darted to the window. The flicker of blue and red lights reflected faintly on the wet pavement outside. His breathing quickened as the reality of what was about to happen closed in around him. There was no way to undo what he had done, no way to explain it that would sound anything other than monstrous. His phone buzzed one last time. The message was short. "They're almost there. I had no choice." David didn't reply. He set the phone down on the coffee table, his hands trembling. His eyes went to Lauren's face. In death, she looked strangely peaceful, and that only made the weight in his chest heavier. He wondered if she had been happy that night, thinking she was building something special for them both. The image was unbearable. The sound of tires on wet asphalt announced the arrival of the police. Lights splashed across the walls of the living room, their colors pulsing against the muted tones of the furniture. David's legs felt heavy as he moved toward the front door. For a moment, he thought about running, slipping out the back into the rain, disappearing into the dark, but the thought was fleeting. There was nowhere to go, and even if there had been, he wasn't sure he had the will to try. The knock on the door was loud, authoritative. A voice called out, commanding him to open it. David stood there for a few seconds, staring at the door, his mind strangely calm now. It was as if the frantic energy of the night had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, hollow acceptance. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers brushing against the metal. When the door swung open, the scene outside was exactly as he had imagined: two officers in dark raincoats, hands poised near their belts, their eyes scanning him quickly before flicking toward the inside of the house. One of them spoke, his tone clipped, telling David to step outside. He complied without a word, his bare feet pressing against the wet concrete of the porch. The rain soaked through his shirt instantly, but he barely felt it. They moved past him into the house, and he could hear their footsteps crossing the living room. One of them muttered something low to the other, the words indistinct over the sound of the rain. A moment later, the second officer returned, his expression unreadable, and placed David in handcuffs. The metal bit into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. As they led him to the patrol car, David glanced back at the house. The lights inside glowed faintly, casting warm rectangles onto the rain-slick driveway. For a fleeting second, he imagined the life he could have been living that night, sharing a meal with Lauren, laughing, completely unaware of how close he had come to destroying everything over nothing. The image dissolved quickly, replaced by the stark reality of the flashing lights and the cold grip on his arms. The door of the police car closed behind him with a heavy thud. The world outside blurred through the rain-streaked glass as the engine rumbled to life. David sat motionless, staring at his reflection in the window. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, his face pale, eyes hollow, hair plastered to his forehead. As the car pulled away from the house, he thought again of the messages, the hotel photo, the apartment complex. Every detail replayed in his mind, now stripped of the sinister meaning he had forced onto them. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Lauren hadn't betrayed him. The betrayal had come from his own mind, from the way he had let suspicion grow unchecked until it became something monstrous. The siren stayed silent on the drive, the only sound the rain hammering against the roof. In the back of the patrol car, David finally closed his eyes. There was no plan now, no next step to consider. Only the long, unbroken path of consequence stretching out ahead of him, each moment leading further away from the life he had destroyed in a single, irreversible night. The cell was cold, its concrete walls damp from years of neglect. David sat on the narrow metal bench, his hands resting limply in his lap, the handcuffs now replaced by the weight of his own stillness. The fluorescent light above him hummed faintly, flickering every few seconds, casting uneven shadows that seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart. He had been processed hours ago, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his clothes, and given the orange uniform that clung uncomfortably to his skin. The events of the night replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each repetition sharper and more unbearable than the last. Somewhere outside the cell, muffled voices carried through the corridor, officers discussing paperwork, a radio crackling with routine updates. None of it touched him. The sound that haunted him most wasn't in the room, it was in his memory, the dull, final silence after Lauren's last breath. He could hear it even now, as clearly as if it were happening again. In the hours since his arrest, pieces of the truth had been delivered to him in fragments, each one a deeper cut than the last. The man he had accused in his mind for months had already spoken to the police. He had shown them proof emails, receipts, photos, all documenting the surprise anniversary plan Lauren had been working on. There had been no affair, no betrayal. The meetings, the secrecy, the strange absences, they had all been for him. She had wanted to give him something beautiful, and instead, he had given her the worst ending imaginable. David's lawyer had visited briefly, a man with sharp eyes and a calm, measured voice. He had explained the charges, second-degree murder, though the prosecution might push for first-degree if they believed the evidence of premeditation was strong enough. David hadn't argued. There was nothing to argue. The law might debate the details of intent, but in his mind, the act was absolute. He had ended her life. That fact alone was unmovable. As the hours passed, David began to think not about what would happen to him, but about the ripple his actions had created. He imagined Lauren's parents getting the call in the middle of the night, the disbelief giving way to a grief so deep it would never heal. He imagined her friends, her co-workers, the people who had seen her only days ago, smiling and alive, now having to reconcile that image with the reality of what he had done. He thought of the man she had asked for help, the one whose messages had sparked his rage, living with the knowledge that his good intentions had inadvertently drawn a target on her back. The air in the cell felt thicker now, as though every thought added another layer to the suffocating weight pressing in on him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. The image of Lauren's face kept intruding, not in anger or fear, but in moments of simple happiness, her laughing on the beach during their honeymoon, leaning against him during long Sunday mornings, humming softly while cooking dinner. Those memories, once comforting, now burned like open wounds. In another part of the city, Lauren's body was being prepared for the coroner's examination. David tried not to think about it, but the knowledge gnawed at him. She was no longer the vibrant woman he had known. She was evidence now photographed, examined, catalogued. The thought that he had reduced her to that was almost worse than the thought of prison. A guard passed by the cell, his keys jangling, and paused to glance in at David. There was no malice in the man's expression, only the impassive look of someone who had seen countless versions of this story before. David didn't meet his gaze. The footsteps moved on, fading into the hum of the building. At some point, David realized he had lost track of time entirely. The lights never changed, the space never shifted, and without windows, he couldn't tell whether minutes or hours were passing. All he had was the steady rhythm of his own thoughts, a metronome ticking out the same question over and over. Why hadn't he just asked her? The answer never came. When the cell door finally opened again, it was for a detective, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't sit down, didn't waste time. She simply read him the details of the case as it stood, the forensic evidence collected from the scene, the witness statements, the timeline built from phone records and surveillance cameras. Every detail was another nail in the coffin of any defense he might have had. When she was done, she looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to see whether there was any part of him that regretted it. David kept his eyes on the floor. The door shut behind her, and he was alone again. This time, the silence felt different, less like the pause between footsteps and more like a final closing of a door he would never reopen. He thought about the trial that would come, about standing in front of strangers while they judged the worst moment of his life without ever knowing the full weight of it. He thought about the years ahead, each one an echo of this same night, trapped in a space where time had no meaning. Somewhere deep inside, David knew there would never be forgiveness. Not from Lauren's family, not from the man she had trusted to help her, not even from himself. The crime was too personal, too irreversible. Even if he served his sentence and walked free decades later, he would still carry her absence like a brand burned into him. As the night stretched on, David lay back on the narrow bench, staring at the ceiling. The flickering light above him buzzed and wavered, sometimes plunging the room into half-darkness before returning. It reminded him of the night itself, brief moments where the truth had almost reached him, only to be swallowed by the shadows of his own paranoia. In the stillness, his thoughts drifted back to the beginning, the first flicker of suspicion that had planted the seed. He had told himself then that he was just being cautious, that protecting what he had was worth a little vigilance. But that vigilance had turned into obsession, and the obsession had turned into a story he told himself so convincingly that it became real. The truth had never stood a chance against the version he had built in his mind. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into a shallow, restless sleep. His dreams were filled with fragments, Lauren's voice calling from another room, the smell of her perfume, the sight of her turning toward him with a look he couldn't quite place. In the dream, she was always just out of reach, slipping away no matter how fast he moved toward her. When he woke, the light above him was still flickering, and the cell was exactly as it had been. But something inside him had shifted. There was no hope of escape, no delusion left to cling to. There was only the long, unbroken path of consequence ahead, and the memory of the life he had destroyed in a single, irreversible night.